and we'll commence with the evening program shortly. Thank you. Good evening once again. We'll just start with a couple of housekeeping notes, if I may. Please notice on the screens you'll see the St. Peter's Facebook address. For those of you that are interested as a media channel and you have strong interest, please stay attuned and interested with what we have to post on a weekly, bi-weekly basis of our events and activities to stay in touch with the dynamics of what we plan and introduce in the near future at St. Peter's. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can appreciate, there is a significant interest and investment to bring the Man of the Shroud exhibition to the community. And if you feel so moved or blessed, then perhaps if you feel it appropriate, you may be able to share an appreciation donation at the appropriate time following Dr. Wiebe's talk. Let us begin and commence. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to St. Peter's Man of the Shroud exhibition. My name is Greg Highland, and it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to be the master of ceremonies this evening for you. St. Peter's is delighted to have with us our distinguished guest speaker and world-authored Dr. Phillip Wiebe, presenting on the Shroud of Turin, Authenticity and Significance of Theology. Dr. Wiebe obtained his doctorate in philosophy from an Australian university and has taught in Canadian universities for over 40 years. He is currently professor at the Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia. Dr. Wiebe's interests is in the weight of evidence, and where he brings his expertise to bear in defending the claim is that the shroud of the burial shroud of Jesus Christ is actually authentic. He has published articles in various topics and has written several books. Dr. Wiebe's lecture this evening surveys the evidence for and against in the view that the shroud depicts Jesus Christ. The material covered tonight includes aspects of the history of the shroud, the evidence of the icons, the 1988 carbon dating, three-dimensional properties, and the Oviedo cloth and botanical evidence, along competing with views of how the image was formed. Kindly welcome a Calgarian reception for Dr. Phillip Wiebe.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you, St. Peter's, for the invitation to come here and join you for a few days and speak on the Shroud of Turin. And I accept its authenticity and have for some time, since the mid-90s. I had studied it for about 15 years before I came to the conclusion that it was the burial cloth of Christ. Now, not everybody might think that, and obviously you have the freedom to think as you will. Even if it isn't the burial cloth of the Lord, the shroud itself is a wonderful icon, if you like, of his suffering, and is such an appropriate object to fix our thoughts on for a few minutes here as Lent comes to an end. I'm conscious of the fact that we are dealing with holy things, and we're touching on holy topics. And so let us pray to be cleansed of every defilement of mind or heart as we think about the suffering of our Lord. The Lord be with you. I speak to you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I need a little bit help from the techies at the back there, perhaps, who can put my first slide up. And so I'm from Vancouver, and I am here with the Vancouver Shroud Association. This exhibit that you see here is one that we've put together and have been loaning out, renting out to parishes for the last 8-9 years or so. And the artifacts at the front are replicas of objects known from Roman history. So they aren't the real thing. I don't think we could afford it anyway, and neither would it be a prudent thing to put out. But the flagrum is very likely after actual whips found from the Roman era, and the lance likely is too. The crown of thorns is an artist's conception, and I'll speak a little bit about that. I'll try to gear this talk for an audience that maybe has modest or little knowledge of the shroud. I'll be touching on many areas of expertise that really aren't mine. More than 24 academic disciplines are involved in the study of the shroud, and I'm a philosopher. I'm interested in evidence, weight of evidence, and so I'm dependent on information that comes from others, experts in the field, and I'll make reference to that as we proceed. Here in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, adjacent to the Savoy Palace in Turin, Italy, Torino, known also as Torino, is a mysterious object, 14 feet long, approximately 3.5 feet wide, and very much like what you see here. The replica in front of you is a photographic replica made by an Italian photographer. And here's the chapel in which the shroud is normally stored, especially made for the Shroud of Turin. It's called the Shroud of Turin because it's been there for the last 450. Crossed arms and legs and so on, and then the back. And parallel to the body are these markings, and these are from a fire that the shroud underwent in 1532. It was patched 2 years later, and the patches were on until 2002. And they've been removed, and the holes made by the fire have been trimmed. An extraordinary thing is that really the image of the man was hardly touched. You could say that the shoulders have been. And it fell right through the cloth. And so you can see how it was folded in order for that event to happen. There are many kinds of markings on the cloth. There's water from dousing the fire in 1532. No doubt there's sweat. And the image itself is a curious thing. It's made by discoloration of the fibrils that make up a thread. We're looking at linen threads here, and you can see the thin little fibrils. They're discolored. Make up the image primarily, but the blood also contributes quite a bit, especially on the back. There's a lot of blood on the back. So here's how the shroud appeared after 2002, and it was the surface of the shroud was steamed and vacuumed, and then the debris was put into vials, and the little vials were correlated with particular regions so that maybe further studies could be done. It's certainly a lot lighter, but I saw the shroud again in 2010. It looked kind of gray in color to me, but I put that down to the acrylic cover that was protecting it. And then also it wasn't well lit, probably by design. Hot lights are not used on it for obvious reasons. It has deteriorated, obviously, over time, and so that is being prevented. It's kept in an inert gas atmosphere in Turin, in the cathedral in Turin. It hasn't moved from Turin, and you're not looking at the real thing. Although it goes on exhibit next year, 2015. So this is quite remarkable that it would be on exhibit 3 times in 15 years, because the pattern has been only 3 or 4 times a century. So there's something happening in terms of interest in the shroud. Let me just draw your attention while I have you on this slide to this little corner here. You can see this cutout on the replica in front of you, just to my left, but there's this little bit here, and this is where a sample was taken for the 1988 dating. And it's a curious little area. You'll see that the shroud, it has 2 pieces to it, and something about 3 feet wide, and then 6 inches, and there's a seam running all the way along. And that's the area from which the sample was took. And the seam is controversial, and why that area was selected, no one knows. But anyway, I'll come to the radiocarbon dating a little later. So here you see the back. Scarred, you can see, and I'll talk about that. The crossed feet, there's quite a bit of blood in the area of the feet. It looks as if one foot is above the other, and if the man had his feet nailed to a cross, well, they likely used a single nail and impaled both feet. Some people think that maybe a block of wood was often used, and so the nail would be inserted into that single block of wood, and then the upright, the stiles of the cross would have notches, and the block could be repositioned. It's actually to increase the agony and the lifespan of the victim. Let me speak about 2 properties of the shroud, 2 interesting properties. The first was discovered in 1898. You could say that this is the beginning of the kind of scientific investigation of the shroud. The shroud was on exhibit. A lawyer asked for permission to take a photograph, and when he did, he was shocked, and so was the world, to discover that actually the shroud image is clearer. which developed 1815, 20, 25, roughly that period of time. Silver nitrate maybe over pewter or lead and some kind of an image, and those are kept in museums. By 1898, photography was well developed, I guess, but well enough developed that Secunda Pia, who took the photos, didn't have his authority recognized. He was just a lawyer, not a photographer, so these couldn't be genuine. And it was in 1931 that the first official photographer, Henri, took photographs, and then the French Academy became very interested. Pierre Barbet wrote a book called A Doctor at Calvary, and you may have seen that title or heard of it. Well, he's from a group of medical doctors who examined really the details of the sufferings of the man depicted here on the Shroud of Turin. So here's the front, seen in negative. This is an Henri photograph. I like the Henris very much. I like the way he lit them. You can see the weave quite clearly, and then I'll speak about this momentarily, but there's a lot of floral material, but not all. You'll see mostly monochromatic. You won't see color photographs very often. The color photographs are interesting because they actually show the blood quite clearly. In many of these photos, you might be unsure about what you're looking at because the burn marks, you know, they look like blood. This is blood here, but these are burn marks, but on the photo they come out the same. So color photographs actually make the distinction. And I'm not quite sure why they're not more widely available, but there it is. Here's the back, seen in negative. You see quite a bit of damage to the back, and I'll speak about that momentarily. And here's the face, seen in positive and negative. So on the left is the shroud face, and you can see the darker patches like the nose, but the eyes are lighter, eyebrows are darker again. And then when you do the flipping of the colors, you get this realistic image of a face. And so in 1978, scientists were permitted to examine the shroud for several days and nights. Barry Schwartz, who works with us, is a photographer from Colorado, and he was the official photographer in that 1978 scientific research project called STIRP. And they didn't sleep. They worked right through the night in order to obtain information. And it was at that time that somebody from NASA, an engineer who worked with the U.S. Space Administration, got the idea of having the shroud photo analyzed by an image analyzer that NASA had built for them. And NASA was taking pictures of planets, the moon, or it was taking pictures of the Earth from space, and these were, say, black and whites, and NASA wanted to interpret them three-dimensionally. They wanted to know whether a line was a riverbed, dry riverbed, maybe a fault line, which would be of maybe more interest even. So they had this VP8 image analyzer built. About 35 were built. I think some estimate that only 2 or 3 are still in existence. But Pete Schumacher brought one to the folks in Colorado Springs that had been involved in this STIRP research project, and the image was analyzed using the image analyzer, and to everyone's surprise, the image has actually 3-dimensional data embedded in it. So the darker the area, like the tip of the nose, the higher, and the lighter, like the area around the eyes, the lower. And so you get a 3-dimensional image. Now, this is not a property that film negatives have. There's nothing in a film negative that records the information about how far the camera is from the object that's imaged. So the shroud has these 2 curious properties. It looks as if dark and light have been reversed, and secondly, the image has this 3-dimensional feature to it, which photographic negatives do not have. The shroud is unique in the world. There is no other object like it. There are paintings that resemble it. There are 50 in Belgium alone, found in churches, and these are thought to have been copied from the Shroud of Turin, maybe pressed up against the shroud as though to imbue them with holiness, and they're taken back for a parish to enjoy. So this comes from a parish in White Rock, near where I live, where the first exhibition that we put on occurred in 2004. So we enjoy it very much, and of course it's more than just enjoyment because of what it stands for, what it represents at the very least. So here's the face 3-dimensionally, and that's not bad, you know, when you think of like a porous cloth having an image on it. I mean, that's not like the kind of plastic that we're used to on which negatives are embedded. That's very dense material, comparatively speaking. Some curious things here. Things are much in the same plane. So the forehead, the nose, the tip of the beard, and so on. Looks like full hair on the lip. And maybe something has obscured the full imaging in the area around the head. And Bishop John Robinson, maybe he's famous for having kind of led the liberals in the Anglican Church in the 1960s, and that's certainly a painful aspect of Anglican faith. I am Anglican, and that's a painful aspect, although it's one I understand, because when I read his book, published in 1962, called Honest to God, and he had removed all miracle from the Christian story, I was, you know, I was overjoyed. I mean, I almost hesitate to say that. I mean, so I came back to faith through a very long and torturous route, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But John Robinson himself became involved with the people who had studied the shroud in 1978, the scientific project, and he conjectures that this is the face cloth that St. John writes about. You know, there's a napkin that lies beside the cloth there in John's Gospel in the description of the resurrection, and Peter and John going into the tomb and seeing the cloths. And for John Robinson, that's what that was. But Robinson died in 85, and he came to Orthodox Christian faith, and the shroud, I believe, contributed to that. He had denied the physical resurrection of our Lord, and he came to affirm it before his death. So the shroud has had an interesting role in the lives of people, myself included. And this Pete Schumacher, he came to faith through working with the shroud. Is the shroud a vehicle for faith? Well, maybe the shroud removes intellectual obstacles more than anything, so that our Lord, the Holy Spirit, can speak to us. Some of us can be quite obstinate, I regret to say. There it is. Now, this is an artist's conception of how the burial would have taken place. It wouldn't be Egyptian mummy-like in character. It would be like this. And the Gospels are curious about the placing of the myrrh and aloes on the body. It's not clear. It's clear that they were purchased and they were there. Whether his body had been anointed is unclear. It seems maybe from John's Gospel that the women came early to do that and then didn't find the body. Anyway, so it could be that, the sheet is laid out, the man is placed on it, and then covered up, but not with spices. So anyway, there's a little difficulty around that, and I won't go into it further. Here is a slide in which the blood has been enhanced, and we're looking at this question. Could this be Jesus? What would be the kind of defining marks of our Lord, and would they be seen on the shroud? Well, we know from the gospel accounts he was crucified, and from the references to him showing his hands, it's, I think, safe to infer that he was nailed. It wasn't a rope, or it wasn't primarily a rope that fixed him to the cross. It was nailed through his hands and his feet. And the other thing is that he was also pierced in the side. And this slide shows quite a large outflow of blood here in the area of the wrist, just below the palm. There's kind of a small indent here, and a nail would slip through there and actually go in this direction so as to hold the arm like on the cross. And so there's the outflow of blood there, and then along the forearms, and that's certainly consistent with arms being up like that. And here, this is a large outflow of blood from the side. And so that seems to be something distinctive. The centurion went to check on the 3 bodies, and I guess the 2 thieves were still alive, and their legs were broken, so they couldn't breathe anymore, really. They had to push down on their feet, and if the legs were broken, that avenue for getting breath, enough curvature into the chest to have a breath, that was lost. Came to Jesus, saw he was already dead, and as though to guarantee his death, he's lanced, and there's this outflow of blood and water, and then the legs aren't broken. So when we look at the image of the back, we see this curious flow right across, and it's blood separated into the heavier and the lighter components, the serous fluid. So there is a very interesting correlation here with the gospel account. Back abrasions in the area here of the shoulders. According to Robert Buckland, at least one forensic pathologist, he performed more than 25,000 examinations of corpses in Los Angeles, one of their large hospitals. And so he looked at the shroud and he said, I can tell you quite a few things about this man just from looking at the photographs. There are back abrasions as though he's brushed up against something. Maybe more disturbing even are all these little markings. They're going in 2 directions, and they're consistent with scourging or flogging, and it's maybe much like the flagrum that we have here on display, which is a replica, but it's still an indication of the kind of thing that the Romans used. They used whips, and they had bone or metal at the end, and it's applied in a flicking fashion so as to tear flesh out. The man of the shroud is flogged all the way from the neck to the ankles. And the number of strokes is excessive, more than 100. So, anyway, the Romans evidently had no limit to the amount of lashing that they would permit upon somebody. Now, flogging is a kind of an act of mercy because you don't last as long on the cross, arguably, if you've been badly flogged. Some people lasted for days, according to certain writers. The Romans didn't talk about it much. It was too gruesome for them. I mean, it's been practiced across the centuries in different places, I regret to say. And even in Dachau, the concentration camp near Munich during the Second World War, crucifixions were carried out. And I don't think they were carefully documented. They're so gruesome and horrible as forms of death that people don't even want to remember. My wife and I visited the Dachau. There's not much there. All the barracks are gone apart from one reconstruction of one. And the area of the ovens is still intact, and also the main administration building. That's all kept up. But the place was so gruesome, we just walked. My brother-in-law and his wife took us there, and we walked for 3-4 hours, and we didn't say a thing. It was so horrific. Death has a way of silencing you, and even if it's no one you know or no one at all connected to you in any of your knowledge, it still is a horrific thing. And crucifixion must have been a horrible thing to watch. Here we have Grunewald. This date on this is, I think it's like 1485, but I'm guessing a wee bit. And he painted the crucified one. And here's the detail on the head, and he depicts the crown of thorns like a cap of thorns, not a circlet. And that's an interesting deviation, let's say, from the medieval image of what the crown of thorns looked like. There's evidence of many wounds to the scalp. Apparently, it's an extremely painful experience to have a sharp object puncture the scalp like that. Here the legs aren't broken. Buckland says the man's about 30, 35 years of age. He's healthy, he's strong. He's maybe 80 kilos, 175, 180 pounds, roughly, and so he can tell that just from the photograph. He's about 5'10", maybe 6 feet. A little hard sometimes to estimate height. The shroud being cloth, of course, can stretch and shrink and so on. So, but 5'10", 6 feet, which is consistent with some archaeological finds in Jerusalem. So there are reasons to think from the gospel accounts that this could be the Lord. Also, something like limestone dust found on the heel, microscopic, so the naked eye doesn't see it. Microscope picks it up. Limestone with strontium-90, radioactive tracer, quite rare in limestone, but there in the Jerusalem area. Oh, so it looks as if maybe he was dragged across a limestone patch and it stayed with the heel and long enough to be picked up, in 1978. Isn't that a marvelous thing? Isn't it a marvelous thing that science, which has convinced many people really that there's nothing to the faith because science prides itself on experimental evidence, isn't it a curious thing that the sciences might actually point in the direction of the authenticity of the man on the shroud. It's an irony, I think, but anyway. So we might ask whether there are any images from the early centuries or the first century that would be consistent with the shroud and seemingly be images of the Lord. So here's a mosaic from an area where Christians lived in the Roman catacombs. There were other people that lived down there, and they're quite huge, extensive. I haven't seen them myself, but I hope to sometime. He was an artist, and he went into the catacombs 1840s, 1850s, roughly that period, and he copied this from something he saw. Here is the bottom of a glass cup, and a petere, it's called, and it's also from the Christian area. And here we have the Lord giving martyrs' crowns to Justus and to Timothy. And notice here we have Alpha and Omega, and so it's seemingly the Lord. And there's no halo, so I put it to you that this is very early. This is before the halo became established as a mechanism for depicting holiness. See the oval face, the long hair draping at the shoulders, the part right down the middle, and so on. You can't tell maybe if he has a beard, but it's a small object, and so it doesn't give us detail. And here's another piece of Roman catacomb art. And this is like art found in Pompeii, which was covered by lava but after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79. It was kind of a retreat for Roman nobility. They had homes there and maybe summer homes, but they had portraits of maybe the Caesar or maybe a senator or a political figure, and it's this style. Rex Morgan from the Shroud Center in Sydney talks about it in one of his books. So that kind of decorative work around a figure that is profile. I mean, not like the first profile I showed you, but you can just see the second eye. Anyway, so there's some art. Could the shroud be of Jesus? Well, the evidence is pointing in that direction, I submit. I'm actually bringing maybe 50 items of evidence to your attention, no one of which is decisive, and around some of which is some uncertainty or ambiguity. And so, but the cumulative effect I offer as a thought to you, the cumulative effect is impressive, even if it isn't decisive. It might be that in many things having to do with faith, there is some evidence that's allowed us in the direction of the faith, but not the kind of proof that we want from kind of a scientific impulse where we demand proof. And so it could be that the Lord prefers to work. He's working with the human mind, but he'll also work with the human spirit, the human heart, if you like, in his own way, but it's not inconsistent with evidence. And I think you see this from the Gospels. After the resurrection, when in Luke's account, one of Luke's accounts, when they thought it was a spirit, Jesus said to them, hey, see, check me out. A spirit doesn't have flesh and bone as you see me have, and they must have touched him, because it's actually the tactile sense that gives you the shape of things. The visual sense can be misleading, and if we think that something isn't really there, we will reach out instinctively. If you go to a science museum and you see a hologram, you want to touch it, but of course there's nothing there. It's just projected in space by lasers. But the tactile touch is actually a surer maybe touch to determine what is real, what isn't real. So he has no difficulty there. I mean, the Lord made us with our senses, and he'll cooperate with them. And Origen, the first theologian, he says that, well, we sometimes get accused of saying, well, just believe. And he said, well, maybe sometimes we say that to people who don't have an opportunity to examine for themselves, but we actually do believe that people should examine for themselves to see if the things that are taught are so. But it's not as though this is going to be just like science, arguably. He will leave something for his own, kind of illuminative or revelatory impulse in our lives so that we kind of know we're on the right track. So, any other evidence that it might be from Israel? Could it have its origin there? Here's a piece of cotton that's in with the linen weave, and likely because the loom on which the linen was woven had earlier been used to weave cotton. And it's of a kind not known in Europe in the 14th century, but known in the Middle East from a long time ago. Here's the distinctive herringbone twill weave. It's 3-in-1, warp and woof, and that's not known in Europe either. Incidentally, we are looking here at the seam right there, and I don't know what this line is. It may be something to do with how the cloth was stretched out. Most of the pollen found on the shroud is from Israel, is from plants unique to Israel. Now, that's not the only pollen that's been found. Pollen from Turkey has also been found. So the shroud arguably has been in Turkey. This is how prosecutors will argue when they argue cases in a court. If pollen is found in a particular region, that clothing, and probably the wearer of it, has been in the locale where the pollen is found. Actually, pollen from Turkey is more common in the face area than other parts of the shroud, suggesting that in Turkey, it's the face that's maybe mostly known. Of course, there's pollen from Europe. Some people say, well, couldn't pollen from Israel somehow be wafted by the wind from Israel to Europe? And I think that the reply to that is no. The prevailing winds there are westerly, not easterly. So it's not European in origin, arguably. So it's from the Middle East somewhere. Now, there are floral images on it, and this has really been coming to light in the last 10, 15 years. And the one who's done the most on this, I think, is Avinoam Deneen, but there are other people. Deneen is a professor of botany at the Hebrew University, and he's cataloging all the plants, trees and plants of Israel, and it's on a website. It's very lovely. He thinks that the shroud is the shroud of Jesus. He says that the flowers on the shroud are the flowers of Israel. And he makes it clear that he isn't speaking as a Christian. And that's often important, I guess, in shroud contexts, that people, they sort of affirm or they deny their faith at the outset as a way of letting their audience get oriented. I heard Deneen in just outside of Rome in 210, and he was looking for a natural explanation for how the image of Jesus got on the shroud. So pistachio plant, another figure that's been involved in studying the botany is Alan Wanger. Alan and Mary have written this book, and they're believers. And he used to be on faculty at Duke University and taught in the medicine division, and in retirement he's taken on the botany of the shroud. Deneen says the rock rose is on it, as well as the bean caper plant. And this is how he sees the flowers around the face. He illuminated the shroud, or probably a shroud photo, that's my guess, with ultraviolet light, and he saw the flower shapes, and he's painted them in here for us so we can see how they're distributed. Now, for the wangers, that's not how the flowers look. The flowers to what would be our right of the face, they're different than that. Anyway, now we're into a debate that only botanists can really enter. And I, as a philosopher, am interested in what they say, how they argue their case, how they counter each other, that kind of thing. But I can't really enter it because I'm not a botanist myself. So this is where the limitations of the different disciplines immediately show themselves. And because so much scientific work has been done, those of us that aren't in a particular science are dependent upon the authority of those who are expert in it. There's debate over coins over the eyes. The first one was reported 1985, a Turin scientist, and one coin is thought to have slipped, and the other seems to be over the eyeball. I myself, I don't know what to make of this point of evidence, but here we're looking at the three-dimensional face again in a slightly different hue and closer up. But Wanger thinks he has a method by which he can determine that the coins might be Pontius Pilate leptons. And when the markings were first discovered, people said, oh, this lettering isn't correct. But the British Museum produced coins with various kinds of lettering and spelling. And so there is something in the British Museum that corresponds to a Pilate lepton. Our associate in the VSA, Barry Schwartz, said he's Jewish. He says, I can't believe that Jewish boys who were involved with the burial didn't have some shekels in their pocket to use instead of Pilate leptons. But anyway, I don't know what to make of that. If it is from Israel, how did it get to Europe? And how did it get to Lire, this smallish city town in France in 1353? Some say 1357. You'll see a little variation on the date depending on which author you read. Ian Wilson has spent much of his life exploring the question of the history of the shroud. He's a graduate of Magdalen College, University of Oxford. He makes his living as a historian. He writes on other topics. If you Google Ian Wilson, you'll see he's written 20, 25 books. But he makes his living selling books, and they're intelligent and well-argued and well-researched and so on. He must have 8 or 9 books on the shroud. So he has put together something of a history, but it's a history from, well, it's from legend, from documents, from art objects. It's not the kind of history that you and I might demand, but we live in a very literate age, and literacy was only 10% in the ancient world, much of the ancient world. Maximum of that, and that maybe was high for some regions. So, I mean, actually the Christian service has evolved partly to serve an illiterate audience, and so art has functioned prominently and in a very helpful way to help worshipers. So there is a story, legend, call it what you will. It's in the annals of this Syrian nation. A King Abgar, being sick, asked Jesus in a letter to come and heal him. Well, Jesus never came, but Thaddeus, likely Thaddeus, came bearing a cloth, and on the cloth was a mysterious image. When Abgar saw it, he was healed of his condition, and he became a Christian. Now, there is numismatic evidence from coins where the crowns of the king don't have symbols suited for the earlier religion, but they are replaced with crosses. So there is evidence for an early conversion. In fact, some say it is the first city-state, or I don't know how large the area was that he ruled, but the first place to become wholly Christian. And his son came to the throne, and he took the kingdom back to the earlier religious practices and beliefs, and the cloth was hidden. And there it lay, hidden for 500 years, almost 500 years, 525. And by that time, Edessa, Urfa now in southern Turkey, just north of the Syrian border. Urfa, Edessa was Christian, and high above a gate in a niche, after a flood had damaged the walls and the gate, this cloth was found. It was perfectly dry, and if it's perfectly dry, the pollen will remain intact, and intact for thousands of years, according to some botanists. So there they found the cloth, and they believed it was miraculous. It had a feature to it that made it look as though it hadn't been painted in the usual way. And so it became venerated and part of Edessan culture and the culture of the church, and actually the Eastern Church. Constantinople wanted it, and the Edessans wouldn't give it up. This is how the Edessa cloth was known, folded arguably like this, according to Wilson, so that you just saw the face. And, well, you'd expect that pollen from Turkey, that is, plants unique to Turkey, would be more concentrated in the face area, and they are. So the face has been more exposed in Turkey, but the rest of the cloth bears primarily pollen from plants in Israel. So 525, the image becomes known and comes to be venerated, and it is arguably the source of the icons for the whole church, both East and West. Here's Pantocrator. We know that as well in the West, I think, as the East does. And it is taken, it appears, from the shroud, and it has some of the distinctive features. It has the long hair and the full beard, also the beard on the lip, a kind of V marking here. It doesn't have the epsilon that you see on the shroud, but the elongated face, hair parted in the center. This becomes a kind of stylized image of how Jesus appeared. There arguably is a received likeness in Western culture. And 100 years ago, in an archaeological dig in Jerusalem, a German archaeologist found a head, alabaster head, and everyone in the group said, "This is the head of Jesus." So there was a received likeness, and people recognized it. Arguably, it's from Pantocrator and other icons that may have been painted from the shroud. Here's an icon from Greece that suggests that more than the face was known, and there is some documentation, and Wilson has all or most of that documentation. Sometimes that kind of documentation hasn't been translated, and so researchers actually have to go to archives and look for things and translate them so that they can be appreciated today. Some other icons here, and 10th century, you have something like the epsilon here on the face, and you have the furrowed brow and the long nose and so on. Another one from France, and here's an icon. It's a bit late, it's 17th century. It tells the story in both pictures and words. This is owned by Queen Elizabeth II. I don't know that it's on exhibit, but it's in her collection anyway. Here's a painting from Templecombe. and that is strikingly like. Templecombe was a commandery of the Knights Templar order, and a very wealthy order. It owned 800 or more than 800 churches and castles across Europe. They were deeply religious, devout, I prefer to say. They dealt in relics, fabulously wealthy, and very influential and powerful. So some speculation is that the Templar order acquired the shroud from Constantinople at its fall in the early 13th century, 1204. So another Templar church, this time across the channel from London. And so Wanger has done his polarized light overlay test on Pantocrator, and he says that the points of comparison are more than double needed for fingerprint identification. Fingerprints now are probably identified digitally, but it used to be done manually. They'd have a picture on file, they would take a fingerprint, and they would compare the two. And using polarized light, they could find points of comparison. So Pantocrator is arguably from the shroud, but known in the church as Eastern Church as the Mendelian, the face cloth of Edessa. Gold coin from the 6th century also shows significant similarity. And here we have a modern icon based on the shroud. The eyes are open here, and I don't think that they are on the shroud. At least most researchers don't think the eyes are open. Here's a map showing the travels of the shroud according to Wilson. I have a friend in Denmark who does talks like this, and he has a slideshow like mine, and I needed this map, and he had one, and so he lets me use it, but all the names are in Danish. You can more or less make them out. The spellings aren't that terribly different. So Lire, and then Chambéry, which is another center of influence, maybe a capital for the Savoy family, and then Turin. What about carbon dating? The 6th of my 7 questions. What about carbon dating? Well, in 1988, a carbon date was done by 3 laboratories, Zurich, Oxford, and Tucson, Arizona. They all got very much the same amount of material. They used slightly different cleaning techniques, and they came up with relatively similar dates. But some people argue that there is a statistically significant difference between the Oxford result and the other 2 laboratories. Now we're into very detailed kind of argumentation, and if that sort of thing interests you, you can find papers on Barry Schwartz's website. You just Google in Shroud of Turin, and you'll go there instantly. He's had more than 4 million, almost 5 million visitors to his site. It's easily the largest site in English, and there is maybe a comparable one in Rome, run by Emanuela Marinella, who's a botanist and does talks like this as well. But she's done more than 1,000 talks like this. She travels all over Italy, and she has the shroud replica rolled up, and she just lays it out and goes. She's very, very amusing, a wonderful lecturer, a lovely, godly woman. We had her in White Rock and enjoyed her very much. So VSA puts on events and sometimes invites different speakers out to complement the few that we're using here. Now, the Lindau man was dated once at 300 BC, another time at 400 AD, and so questions have been raised about the reliability of carbon dating. Maybe carbon dating shouldn't be used by itself. Maybe it should supplement other methods of dating. So some people say porous materials don't date very well. Now we're into the area of physics behind carbon dating. The idea is quite straightforward. Probably many of you are familiar with it, but neutrons from outer space enter our atmosphere, which is mostly nitrogen, N14. And if a neutron penetrates the nucleus of a nitrogen atom, it'll convert it to C14. Normal carbon is C12, and radioactive carbon is the C14. There may be 13 as well, little variations. Well, C14 it will decay. It has a long half-life. Half its mass disappears in about 5,700 years. And so to date an object, the comparison of C12 to C14 is done. Plants are absorbing carbon, and they don't distinguish between C12 and C14, and so you measure the relative amounts, and that's how you get the dating. So very little C14, it's old. Lots of C14, it's relatively recent. So these are issues now for physical chemists to debate and decide, and I'm still waiting to hear on how reliable carbon dating is. There's a curious thing about the shroud. You can see it easily on the replica just to my left, but on the slide you see the 4 holes. They're like L-shaped and they're on both sides. And an interesting document from 1192 in Hungary, it depicts this man. Look at the halo, uniquely marking Jesus, the crossed arms, just like the shroud. And here we're looking at a herringbone weave in that area. And there's some detail there which I'm highlighting here, and it's this L shape, the 4 holes. What a curious thing. So it looks as if the Pray manuscript comes from the shroud, and somebody copying it as best they can does the weave as best they can, but they put the holes in too. And this is, well, 50 years or more, 50 years before the date given in the carbon dating result, 1988. So anyway, there are many of these questions. Garda Valdez wrote a book called The DNA of God, a botanist. He thinks that because botanical materials acquire a veneer, a plastic veneer, it might have interfered with the decay of C14. And so when the dating was done, much more C14 is there than should have been there. I mean, I'm not in a position to argue it again. It's something that botanists. My impression is that Valdez's position is not widely shared, not among the people that I've met in Shroud conferences or people whose work I've read on the topic of the Shroud. There's another object about which I won't say too much. It seems to be a face cloth, perhaps, of the man of the Shroud. The blood type is the same. It's AB blood type. The fresh blood spatters on the sudarium of Oviedo, this is in northern Spain, they're like the top of the head. And I think I maybe didn't talk about the bleeding from the top of the head, or maybe I did. But anyway, there's kind of a match between this cloth and the shroud. This cloth has a lot of lung fluid, and this is how Wilson and others, there's a Mark Gussin, Guscin, that lives in Oviedo, and he's translating documents that have never been translated out of Spanish or early Spanish or Latin or some other language, and he's making them available, and it's shedding light on the history of this cloth, which came across North Africa from Jerusalem starting in about the 6th century. So they're just interesting bits of information here that strongly suggest that the shroud is the shroud of Jesus, and that we can see it as sort of reinforcing reinforcing the New Testament. There's a chemist by the name of Rogers who's done work, and that's most recent. 2005, he wrote an article and published it in a chemistry journal in which he argues that the shroud sample taken in 1988 is not representative. He's examined the area, he's had a bit of the sample area in his possession, as well as shroud material from pollen samples he took, and he says they're rather different. There's gum and cotton and dye on the sample area, and he's compared the two areas, the carbon-14 sample, all these different elements, and the rest of the shroud doesn't have these features. So from a chemical point of view, he says that it's not representative and the date shouldn't be taken at face value. The last question, how might the image have been formed? And might it somehow be implicated in the resurrection? This has interested many people as a possibility. John Jackson was part of the Stirp team in 1978, and he developed a theory which has been called the weak dematerialization theory. And the idea basically is that some force stronger than anything known in the natural world broke the man apart at the subatomic level. So the muon bonds that hold protons and neutrons intact in every atom of your and my body, and also his body, the muon bonds were broken. The heavy material bombards the cloth and records the image of the front and the back of the man, and the electrons go to the flowers, and as soon as they touch the linen, there's an electrostatic transfer and images of flowers are produced. So that's roughly the theory. And on the right, we're looking at a fiber from the image area, and on the left, a non-image area. And we're looking at the face showing the pointillistic character of the image. It's almost pixel-like in character, and you'll see that mentioned in some publication. The color variations are so fine, if they're done with a brush, they're not, but they would be done with a brush with a single hair, thinner than a human hair, and you'd dip it in corrosive material, put it on the shroud, and you'd reverse dark and light and create an anatomically perfect image. This is crazy. This wasn't done that way. Gus Exeta is a bladder surgeon that has joined with Jackson in exploring this idea that somehow the mass of the man, the matter that comprised his body, is implicated in the imaging. So Exeta had himself injected with the technetium-99 that he uses in his bladder surgery normally, waited for some hours until every molecule of the body has the radioactive tracer bound to it, and then he had himself imaged. And you see him there on the left, and this is just a two-color image, and the one on the right, obviously, is a comparable one of the man of the shroud. Now, here we have a three-dimensional portrayal of it, and you see the lovely roundedness of the thighs and the shin, knees, maybe some distortion in this area, maybe some ribs, kidneys perhaps. So you see some details there. Now, the man of the shroud, it's not as striking. This is three-dimensional image. The legs are really quite well defined. I don't know that you can say you see bones there, but look at Exeta's crossed hands. So there's 2 to 3 times as much, 2 to 3 times of the radioactive material coming from the palms here compared to the fingers. And so there's a drop-off here where the one hand covers the other. And these look short, and these maybe look a bit long. But look at the hands of the man of the shroud, how curious they are. And here you see what looks like a drop-off, and the fingers are kind of short, and these are inordinately long, as though we're looking at not fingers only, but finger bones. Below the surface imaging, the conjecture is that the man has left an image of himself at the subatomic level. Anyway, this is being explored at a laboratory nuclear facility near Rome, and the folks in Frascati put a conference on, and they published their work, and it's on the web too. Lazzaro and Baldaccini, both of whom I met. I don't think the other two listed there were present at the conference, but here's laser light that has irradiated a linen surface, and the top part's been heated. And so they're trying to show that there is some substance to the view of Jackson, of Exeta, and Thaddeus Tren, a friend of mine recently deceased, who taught at the University of Toronto. And here finally we look at half a skull and half of the shroud face, and here you see teeth and roots of teeth. And what's that? So, the third curious attribute of the man of the shroud is that there's below the surface imaging. And the idea is this, that he comes apart at the subatomic level, and the shroud is evidence, you see, that a resurrection occurred when no one was noticing it. It leaves a trace in the physical world, a trace that only the sciences of the 20th century can understand and interpret. And that is the shroud. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wiebe, for a most thought-provoking and informative presentation. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, if there's a chance to share an appreciation gift if you so desire. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge our online viewers. This evening's presentation is being streamed through our website onto the internet, and it'll be held in the archive. So should you wish to revisit at any comfortable time at the comfort of your home, that is available to do so as well. At this time, I'd also open up the floor to any questions that many of you have had, and then I'll have the privilege of leading in the first. Dr. Wiebe, I find the science investigation particularly interesting to me, particularly the radio tracers, given my formal education is in nuclear medicine. Could you perhaps share with us and expand on what's happened in the last 10 years regarding the science around the shroud?
Yes. Let's say the last 10, 15 years, so I would say the distinctive developments are the unlocking of the information concerning the botanical material, especially the floral material, suggesting that the shroud is from Israel. And I think that a second important development is the work of Rogers. Here it's detailed in this book, which argues that the 1988 carbon dating result isn't really representative of the shroud. And then I would say that the work in Frascati of scientists attempting to somehow replicate the imaging found on the shroud. I mean, there is no replication possible of a whole body, nothing close to that, but even working with subatomic sources for image formation, those are the most interesting developments from my point of view.
Fascinating. Now I'll extend the microphone to anybody who would like to participate in sharing a question. Just place your hand up with a $50 bill and I'll respond twice as fast.
I'm just curious to know whether or not they did any DNA testing on the blood stains to prove the race of the person that was under
I don't know that detailed DNA work has been done. I've been told that the blood is too degraded to do detailed work, but there could be developments in the last 5-10 years which would change that. The blood type is AB, which is found in about 2% of the population, general, and about 18% of the Jewish population. So the blood type is very consistent with being Jewish, and it is the blood of a male. X and Y chromosomes have been found, and the blood also has high levels of bilirubin or bilirubin in it, which is a secretion that turns blood kind of an orange color, and babies that have jaundice have that, but also people who are tortured. So no medieval forger arguably thought of adding the blood of a tortured victim to make it realistic, because they didn't know about bilirubin until the 20th century.
Interesting. Next question.
Good question.
I find, as I've given myself a little bit more time to reflect on your informative talk, Professor Wiebe, the shroud obviously touches many of us in many ways. Could you please tell us how important it is to Catholics, and equally so, how important it is to Protestants?
Yes. I think that both Catholics and Protestants are being affected by what we could call the modern turn, the naturalistic turn in culture, probably because of the large influence that science is having over our lives. And there's kind of like a new gold standard for evidence, and Christian faith is maybe seen as not measuring up. The gold standard is, articles published in esteemed journals and blind reviewed by peers, right? That's kind of the standard, and I'm not objecting to that. It's just that standard of evidence is increasingly becoming important. And that is making, Christianity being a historical faith so profoundly. I mean, it's not like Buddhism maybe, where you seek enlightenment and you read different people that have achieved it and they're giving you steps. I mean, that's not so historically bound, but Christian faith is very historically bound to a man who was the revelation of God to mankind and lived and died and came back to life and so on. So it's historical and consequently empirical. And so the scientific impulse in Western culture is causing people to question faith. And I think that's happening in both Catholic and Protestant circles. Maybe in Protestantism it's gone further than it has in Catholicism. Protestants have been so reliant on the Bible, but the Bible has come under such severe criticism in the last 200 years. So the shroud is rescuing the historicity of the life of Jesus, and it's also showing us that it is a faith that isn't scared of science. In fact, it needs science to interpret. The shroud needs science to interpret it. God isn't scared of science. He can work with it. And he can work with skeptics too.
Fascinating. Any questions from the floor, perhaps? Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I don't have a question. It's just that since there's nobody else, I'm going to say it anyway. I consider myself a very scientifically inclined man, and I don't see that affects at all the faith. Wouldn't you say that rather than science, it's more the empirical thinking that counters faith and that kind of stuff? Because empiricists, for some reason, have tried to dethrone and take out the argumentative science, logic, philosophy, all that, which to me are just as scientific as the rest. Wouldn't you agree with that?
You raise a lot of complex questions, including, the history of empiricism and the history of rationalism and their competition with one another and their role, one especially in British culture and the other more continental, and philosophy and consequently theological views have been influenced by both schools of thought. I'd say that we can embrace science. We can embrace science without holding that it is the only way to knowledge. And in the area of faith, the heart must be open to something, because faith is usually going to change us and the way we are, and eventually changes our character too if we let it. So faith it has that intimidating part to it, because it wants to get right into you, your deepest self, and change that and make us all, more loving and juster and kinder and so on. Those things. So it's an important question. I mean, we seemingly know things maybe with the heart that the head doesn't quite want to admit or quite want to follow in. And I always thought that the heart was mostly emotion, and I never trusted emotion at all. I was raised in the home of a Protestant minister. So the Bible was bigger than the church. I could dismiss the church. I think that's harder for both Orthodox and Catholic. The role of the church is stronger. But there are very big issues here that you raise, and I can't do more than just touch on them lightly. But the heart and the mind can be fully used, I think, and God He's not troubled by that.
Excellent question. Thank you for sharing. There's another question.
Thank you. Good evening, Professor.
Yes.
If I understood you correctly, you mentioned that the face on the shroud seemed to disappear when viewed 12 feet or closer. I was wondering if a photograph has been taken at that distance, and if the face is visible in that photograph or not. Thank you.
Yes. Let me just clarify. The whole image disappears if you stand closer than 6 feet. But you can take a photograph. And what a curious thing that the image just would blend into the cloth, and yet, like, this is a photograph. It's a photograph. It's developed on linen with a bit of a plasticized surface for more permanence. But yes, it's a curious thing. Photographs can be taken, but seeing it, you have to stand. Optimal viewing distance is about 10, 12 feet.
Interesting. Excellent question. Professor, we've given your dedication and life investment around the shroud. Could you please share the meaning and the significance of what perhaps it represents to you?
Yes. Well, I abandoned Christian faith when I was 18, 19, I regret to say. It was all the metaphysical and miraculous part of it that I abandoned. I didn't abandon the ethic. I always respected the ethic. But I never expected to be a Christian. So I didn't think, that the physical resurrection occurred, or the virgin birth, the virginal conception, things like that. And so I followed this Bishop Robinson when I read his book. In fact, I rejoiced, I may have mentioned that, when I read it, because it was describing the beliefs I'd come to. So, as the story often goes, I fell in love, and the girl that I married really loved the Lord and knew the Lord, and said, he had been real to her since she was 11 or so. Both frightened and attracted me. And so I, went to church, and we would find a church that would be agreeable to the both of us. I went to a church in which a psychiatrist preached. I thought, he's not paid to say these things. He has a practice and he's a professor. So he's well paid apart from being a pastor. So he's not just telling me these things because he's paid to say them. I thought, I guess I'll listen to him. And actually the Lord, I think, began working in me because his sermons moved me a lot, and that shocked me. I didn't like tears, and I didn't like to be moved. And then I met visionaries who said that Christ had appeared, and I had the great privilege of meeting 30 of them and interviewing them in detail on 26 different variables, really, concerning the nature of their experience. And I discovered that some of them were like the New Testament appearance accounts, and that also radiance often accompanied it, sometimes so much so that facial features couldn't even be seen. So there was Barry Dick, a young Bible college student at 18 or 19 in hospital at St. Luke's in Bellingham, Washington, near where I live. He had broken 3 neck vertebrae skiing on Mount Baker. His goggles fogged up, and he went over this embankment, and when he hit the bottom, the skis flipped up and hit the base of his neck and broke vertebrae. And he was in horrible pain, he says. On the 8th night, this glowing figure appeared at the end of his bed, and he was all trussed up, instructions not to move. Barry grasped the forearms. He was young, impetuous, maybe not very trained in matters spiritual, but he said that it had solidity, the arms had solidity, and he felt his fingers touch what he saw them touch. So he was actually sensing in 3 modalities, visually, tactilely, and then proprioceptively or vestibularly. So it's a very complex sensation. And this psychiatrist, who'd also had a vision of Christ, he didn't think that experiences like that were hallucinatory. He thought there was something real. So I began to think there's more to the New Testament, and then I began to be interested in the Shroud. That came my way in 1981, and I studied it for 15 years before I became convinced of its authenticity. I thought I had more or less settled all the questions of the resurrection, but I went to see the Shroud in 2000, and there I was, just a tourist, looking at it, mostly because I lectured on it, and sometimes people in the audience had seen it and I hadn't, and that was embarrassing for me, so I thought, well, I'll go see it. And no, there was no pilgrimage involved. I was just a philosopher. That's all. And well, anyway, I had a most extraordinary, you may think I'm crazy, but I thought that the Shroud spoke to me. And it was such an odd thing because it isn't like something you imagine, but I don't believe that others heard what I heard. But the voice said to me, the resurrection's real, Philip. Just like that, firm but friendly with a little lilt at the end. And I thought, oh, what's this? And then half a minute later, if this man had such a remarkable end to his life, the very remarkable beginning described of him is possible. And it was an if-then, which are quite gentle as statements. And the is possible was said just like that at the end. It was so, no, I wouldn't say hesitant, it was just gentle. I knew instantly I'd never accepted the virgin birth, and I didn't think I ever would. I would be a Christian without believing the creed, really, which is kind of odd, you know, but in Protestantism, you get great variety in terms of unbelief, disbelief and belief. I regret to say, well, that's just how it is. I'm being honest. And so the Shroud assumed a huge significance for me. And then the voice said a third thing which puzzled me for a long, long time. And the voice said, and the preamble wasn't mentioned, it just sort of hung in the air without having to be said. This man's remarkable, is the kind of the preamble. But the question was, and why would such a man die? Why would such a man die? Surely his enemies didn't catch him by stealth. He knew what was happening. Anyway, so I've pondered the death of our Lord, and I've read the book of Hebrews a great deal, where, of course, his great sacrifice is described, and its significance for us, and the new order, and the new covenant he's brought us into, and all of that wonderful gospel story. So, yeah, the shroud has been big for me, and I'm delighted to speak on its behalf. But of course, it can speak for itself.
Thank you, Professor Wiebe. I'm sure I'm not alone, but wouldn't you say that was an inspiring opportunity to hear Dr. Wiebe this evening? I agree.
Thank you. Bless you. Bless you.
As we come to a close, ladies and gentlemen, there's an opportunity to share a name and perhaps your comments. I would invite your comments to let us know how we're doing with respect to this wonderful caliber and prestige of this exhibit, the content of the presentation. Kindly share your comments in the sign-in book that is located in the posterior portion of the narthex. Also, in closing, I'd like to say I thank the online viewers for joining us tonight and also sharing the excitement as well. And again, that can be revisited from the archive once it's posted on our website. And in closing, on behalf of Father Jerome Levine, Kusum, our events coordinator, Caroline, our exhibit shroud director, Professor Wiebe, and myself, sincerely thank you and deeply for coming tonight and sharing your precious time and making it wholesome for everyone a lot. Good night, safe home, and God bless.